বাঙালির রক্তে ব্যবসা আছে, মাথা নিচু করেনি কারোর কাছে। দাপটটা ছিল থাকবে আছে, বাঙালি নিজের স্বার্থে বাঁচে। নতুন সূর্য উঠছে দেখো, তার চোখেতে চোখটা রাখো। নতুন সূর্য উঠছে দেখো, তার চোখেতে চোখটা রাখো। লাল আকাশের গায়ে আঁকো নতুন ভোরের আবাহ। বাংলার নবজাগরণ, বাংলার নবজাগরণ, বাংলার নবজাগরণ, বাংলার নবজাগরণ।
One of the things is certainly that you will enjoy today is his very bold nature and his ability to make very complex things simple. He's written 6 books, 6 best-selling books. He's a person who asks questions, hard questions. He doesn't fear anyone. And by asking questions, he has changed India in many, many aspects. I will just say a few of them. He questioned the banking system, the debt banks who are destroying the debt system. He cleaned up that system. He questioned the patent system, where intellectual property protection, where startups and entrepreneurs and innovators apply and have to wait for a long time. He cleaned up that system and significantly reduced the wait time. He liberalized the drone laws. And most importantly, he is a man who is a historian, who's a policymaker. He's not just an advisor who gives advice to the Prime Minister, but the Prime Minister trusts him to execute on those advices and make them a reality. তো কালকে ওনাকে জিজ্ঞাসা করছিলাম, স্যার বেঙ্গলের জন্য কি হবে? বাঙালি আপনি, আমরাও বাঙালি, বাংলাকে কি আমরা ভুলে গেছি না বাংলার হোপ আছে? He said, we have tremendous plans for Bengal and they're all in the making, and I'm definitely one of those people taking the initiative to do that. And he shared a few wonderful things which I will not share, I'll let him introduce, but let's put our hands together for the wonderful, the most knowledgeable and the most amazing Bengali sons whose grandparents created the Onushilan Shomiti. So from the freedom fighting era till date, this family, the Sanyal family, has given a lot to Bengal, and we are very fortunate to invite Sanjeev Sanyal to give his keynote. Let's put our hands together. So, the stage is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a particular pleasure to be here today. So let me first of all thank the Bengal Business Council for giving me this opportunity to come here and speak on a topic on which, as you will realize shortly, I'm very passionate about, which is the whole topic of reviving the Bengali spirit of enterprise and risk-taking. Now, of course, many other communities have come to Bengal and contributed enormously to the business and entrepreneurship culture of this state. The Marwadis, Gujaratis, Armenians, many others. I have utmost respect for their contribution, but today I'm going to focus on a subset, which is the history of Bengali entrepreneurship, and specifically of the Bengali-speaking ethnic group to which I myself belong. I'm going to make this the focus because I think every people ultimately are driven by the stories that they tell themselves. And unfortunately, in recent generations, Bengalis have come to tell themselves that Bengalis are very good at doing multiple things, but not in running business. বাঙালিরা ব্যবসা চালাতে পারে না, সবকিছু করতে পারে কিন্তু ব্যবসা চালাতে পারে। Now this is a story we have told to ourselves. As I told you, ultimately a people are driven by the stories they tell themselves. So if the story that we have told ourselves is that we cannot do business, then we'll never be able to do business. But, oddly, our history is completely different. The history of the Bengali people is in fact all about trade, it's all about enterprise, it's all about industry. And it's an absolutely fascinating history which I am now going to tell you. And I hope then to be able to change some of those narratives that we have of ourselves. So let's go back right to the beginning. Now the landscape of Bengal, as you all know, is a riverine deltaic landscape opening out to the Bay of Bengal. And not surprisingly, our history is very much about maritime trade. We even have a bay named after us, the Bay of Bengal. And not surprisingly then, Bengal was home to some of India's most ancient and important ports right from the beginning of recorded history. So just a little north of here, there is an ancient port called Chandraketugarh, which goes back where archaeological finds have been found from the 5th century BC onwards. So it's near Barakpur, not far from here. And there's another port which is near Kharagpur called Tamralipti, now called Tamluk, where archaeology goes back to at least the 3rd century BC. Now these two ports were the most important ports of first the Mauryas and later of the Gupta period. So we have lots of archaeology and we have also lots of literary evidence. For example, from people who came to study at Nalanda, the Chinese pilgrims who came here. For example, the Chinese pilgrim Fa Xian, many of you know of him, and he came to Tamluk or Tamralipti then, and he stayed there and studied Sanskrit for several months before he sailed to other parts of the world, I think to Sri Lanka and other places. Maybe somebody can switch off the music, it is kind of unnecessary and annoying. Now, one of the problems with the riverine landscape is of course that this landscape keeps changing. So one of the problems is that the river channels that are used as the ports keep shifting, they keep silting up and so on. And so not surprisingly, these locations also kept, the locations of the ports kept also changing. So the locations of Tamralipti and Chandraketu where ultimately those channels did get silted up. And so by the medieval period, we see that the ports begin to shift. Now that doesn't mean that the importance of maritime trade and industry diminished. Far from it, medieval Bengali folklore is full of merchants and entrepreneurs. Let me see how many of you know the story of Chand Saudagar. How many of you know the story? Quite a few people here know the story of Chand Saudagar. It's a story which is very popular in medieval Shakta tradition, and it is mentioned in a kavya called the Manasa Mangala Kavya, which tells the story of a merchant who used to sail the high seas and about how he lost 7 ships and was ruined by seven shipwrecks that happened in the high seas, and how he lost 7 of his sons. And then his youngest daughter-in-law, Behula, took her husband and followed her husband to the land of the dead, where she pleases the goddess Manasa and brings back not only her own husband, but all the 7 sons and prosperity back to Chand Saudagar. And how then he becomes a devotee of Manasa Devi. Now I'm not here to discuss the religious or philosophical connotation of the story. What is interesting is that the story is about a rich merchant and his voyages. Now we don't know exactly where Chand Saudagar's home was. The place is called Champak Nagar. We don't know where Champak Nagar is. there is one tradition that may have been in East Bardhaman district, somewhere where the Damodar River meets the Bhagirathi. But we don't know. There's an Assamese tradition that he was from somewhere in Assam. But nonetheless, we do know that Chand Saudagar would then go from his, whatever his base was, in Champaknagar, to a major port called Saptagram or Sadgam. This is in Hooghly district, and we still have a place there by that name, even today. And so by the medieval period, this becomes the real hub of maritime trade from Bengal, and there are lots of merchants and lots of stories about them. And it then becomes ultimately a part of the kingdom of Bhursut, of Bhurisishta, of the king Rudra Narayan. Now this is the kingdom that also later becomes famous as the kingdom of Rani Bhavashankari, or Rai Bhagini as she's also known, and the great battles that she had with the Afghan kings. But the source of this kingdom's wealth was trade, international trade. Now by the time you have the European period, Hooghly, which is basically the general area of Satgam, becomes a center of a large number of mercantile settlements. The Hooghly itself was a Portuguese settlement. Then you had Chandanagar, which was a French settlement, Srirampur, which was a Danish settlement, Chuchura, which was a Dutch settlement, and of course, Kolkata, which was the British settlement. Now, all of you know the history of how Jock Charnock came here in the late 18th century, and he purchased 3 villages, Govindapur, Sutanoti, and Kolikata. Kolikata is, of course, after which Kolkata of today is named. The name derives from it. Now, you get the impression very often from this story that these were agricultural villages. But in fact, they were not agricultural villages. They were actually weaver and artisanal villages and centers of trade. There were the Seths and the Boshaks, who were merchants who lived here. They were not jomidars, as very often people think. In fact, the Jagir of this area was in fact owned by the Roy Chaudhary family. And it is they who in fact sold the Jagir of those 3 villages to the British East India Company. But the name Sutanoti itself is interesting. Suta is the cotton thread. That's where the name comes from. And Sutanoti was actually a wholesale market for textiles. So it is important that you realize this area was actually very much a trading area. These villages were artisan villages, and there was huge amount of business going on. In fact, as I said, these families of Seths and Basaks and so on were merchants. They were not jomidars, as some people may have the impression. But by the 19th century, of course, this was an English East India Company town. But even the very important characters of that period, very often called the Bengali Renaissance, many of them were actually entrepreneurs and businessmen. So very often the Bengal Renaissance is thought in terms of the artistic achievements or social reforms and other such things. But many of the important characters of that time were in fact businessmen. Raja Ram Mohan Roy was a moneylender and financier. People forget that. Dwarkanath Thakur, the ancestor of Ravi Thakur, made his money originally in trading indigo and, hold your breath, opium. So he was an opium drug runner. And essentially he was exporting opium through Hong Kong to China. That's how he originally made his money. He also bought in 1832, he bought a coal mine in Raniganj. So he was a pioneer in coal mining. And he also set up a bank in 1829 called Union Bank. Don't confuse it with the Union Bank of India that you have today, that's has a different lineage. But there was an original Union Bank that Dwarkanath Thakur set up in 1829. It's a different matter that The records of the time suggest that there was a lot of conflict of interest in his activities as banker and activities as indigo trader, and where one would argue that monies were being diverted to his indigo interests from the bank. But that's a different story. But I'm just pointing out to you that even the Thakur family really made its money from entrepreneurship and trade. They were not rent-seeking jomidars, as some people have the impression. And then, of course, the single most important character of the Bengal Renaissance. It was a woman, by the way, Rani Rashmani. Rani Rashmani is perhaps the single most important character who triggered the Bengal Renaissance. She's the person who funded, for example, the Dakshineswar temple. The land on which Eden Garden stands today was originally her land, and she was a canny businesswoman who did many things, including picking fights with the East India Company on all kinds of issues. And it's she who brought in Ramakrishna Paramhansa to become the head priest of Dakshineswar temple. No Ramakrishna Paramhansa, then there would be no Vivekananda. No Vivekananda, and you wouldn't have Sri Aurobindo, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, AJC Bose, and many other greats of the Bengali Renaissance. So I always say that Rani Rashmani was such an important character, and she too was a businesswoman. So as you can see that there is always throughout our Bengali history important moments, including in those moments which are not directly related to entrepreneurship, are driven by people who are entrepreneurs. And we are not even unique in this. If you go back and look at European Renaissance is also ultimately driven by entrepreneurs. You go to Florence, people who go to Florence and look at all the art and culture, they go to Venice and look at all the buildings. But in fact, Florence's true source of wealth was not art and culture, it was banking. They are the people who invented double-entry bookkeeping systems. Venice invented the stock market. All those beautiful buildings that you see are actually the second-order benefits of wealth creation through entrepreneurship. So the same was true here in Bengal. The Bengal Renaissance, of which we are proud, all the literature that was created, was all ultimately driven through the economics of entrepreneurship and risk-taking. And this was also true as we move into the 20th century. And here there is a huge shift as India moves into modern entrepreneurship, the kind that you and I would now recognize as modern business. And here too, it was triggered by, to a large extent, driven by business. So for example, we all know about 1905 partition of Bengal. It was the beginning of the nationalism, the freedom, the last phase of the freedom struggle. And as a result of that, we also see the triggering of the Swadeshi movement. Now the Swadeshi movement has unfortunately now got the connotation of something to do with Mahatma Gandhi and Charkha and Khadi and so on. But in fact, the original Swadeshi movement was a modernist movement. It was about getting Indian businessmen and women to go into modern industries, to go into steel, to go into textiles, to go into chemicals. That was what the Swadeshi movement was. And in fact, there was a great deal of discomfort amongst the Bengali community about what they then considered was a hijacking of this movement by Gandhi into what somewhat more traditionalist, one could even argue, Luddite trajectory. But the original Swadeshi movement, at a time when Gandhi was still in South Africa, had a completely different connotation. And as a result of that Swadeshi movement, a number of Bengali entrepreneurs stood up and created remarkable businesses, some of which are still around today. So I'm going to name a few of them. One of them was Calcutta Chemicals, set up in 1916 by K.C. Das, by the way, grandfather of Swapan Das Gupta, in case you were not aware. And they were famous for creating the Margot soap from neem extract. This soap is still available, I think produced by Henkel India. but it is still available today. But in addition to Margo soap, there was they produced lavender dew powder and Mahabhringoraj hair oil. So these were all the products that were produced by them. Then there was Lakshmi Tea, which was originally set up in 1912 by P.C. Chatterjee, grandfather or great-grandfather of Rudra Chatterjee. Some of you may know him. And it was originally set up as the India Tea and Provisions. And I want to mention this, that there is a very close link between all of this entrepreneurship and the nationalist freedom struggle. Because the same family of Chatterjees at the same time were participating in the revolutionary movement as well, in the Anishalan Samiti and so on. So, India Tea and Provisions ultimately evolved into what we now know as Lakshmi Tea, and of course today they are the owners of Makai Badi Tea Estate and other big tea estates around the world, by the way, not just in India, in Rwanda and many other places. Less remembered is Radhanath Shah. Now, Radhanath Shah was quite a character. He had literally hundreds of patents in his name, many of them related to fountain pens, nibs, inks, all kinds of things, and he set up the Lakshmi Stylo Pen Works in 1907 in Banaras. And his pens were very famous in the first half of the 20th century. No less than Ravi Thakur, Mahatma Gandhi, Ambedkar, Rajendra Prasad, they all used Lakshmi pens. And this company existed all the way into the 1950s. So you can see that there were all these people, many of you may not even know these names, but they were major characters in the Kolkata of 100 years ago. Not just Kolkata, but in fact of India. Now I'm going to tell you about another very remarkable person, Mohini Mohan Chakraborty. How many of you heard of Mohini Mohan Chakraborty? There's a very small 3-4 people here who have heard of Mohini Mohan Chakraborty, so let me tell you a little bit about him. Mohini Mohan Chakraborty started life as a mid-level civil servant. He served as a deputy magistrate and various other posts, and then he retired from civil service. And then in 1905, following the Bongo whole agitation and the Swadeshi movement, he decided to set up a very small cotton textile operation in his house in Kushtia, which is now in Bangladesh, which was part then of the undivided Nadia district. And so in 1905-1906, he set up a small partnership with his sons. He had 4 sons, so 3 of them joined him, to create Chakravarti Brothers. And so they set up this textile to make dhotis and saris and so on. And it was quite successful. So a couple of years later, on the 18th of August 1908, Chakravarti Brothers was expanded into a public limited company called Mohini Mills Limited. It had 14 directors. One of them, one of his biggest investors at that time, was no less than Rabindranath Tagore. So it was a business in Noida, funded by his neighbor, because Ravi Thakur also came from there, used to live there, and had a family home there. And this business then dramatically expanded from there on. So by 1918, they were producing dhotis, saris, medical supplies like bandages, bed sheets, and so on, and become one of the biggest textile mills in India by that time. The British were not happy with this sudden development, and while during the First World War, they were not too unhappy with, expansion. After the war finished, there was obviously, the orders fell and there was competition. So they went after Mohini Mills and decided to impose all kinds of taxes on them, including a 5% tax on imports of inputs, and they would deliberately behave unfairly. For example, this 5% tax was done on weight, but that weight included the stem on which the yarn was wound, which is obviously unfair because the stem is not yarn, and so on and so forth. But it didn't matter. The business continued to grow. Mohini Mohan died in 1922 at the age of 84. his three sons continued the tradition and kept expanding. And so in 1942, in the middle of the Second World War, this company gave a 25% dividend, which amounted to 35.6 lakhs at that time, a very significant amount of money. And at its height in the late 40s, Mohini Mills had 48,000 spindles and 975 looms in its main unit in Kushtia. And it had set up a smaller mill in Belgudia, much smaller, again not far from here in Belgudia and Kolkata. But of course, like many others in Bengal, they were hurt by partition. Their mill ended up on the wrong side of the border. They kept it going through the 50s, but then after the 1965 war, the mill was declared as enemy property. The Chakravarti family, much of it had already moved to Kolkata by this point. One branch of the family remained in Kushtia and got into very serious trouble, as you can imagine, in 1970-71 in the period, in the genocide period before the 1971 war. That branch of the family, incidentally, are the grandparents of the writer Sudeep Chakravarti, in case you've heard of him. But the other branch who moved here constitute my own family. Many of you may know about my father's family and their contributions to the freedom struggle, the Sanyals. But my mother's family are Chakravartis, and Mohini Mohan Chakravarti is actually my great-great-grandfather from my mother's side. Now obviously that family that moved here began to try and expand this smaller factory they had in Belgudia. And for a little while it succeeded. But then came Jyoti Basu and the left-front government. By the early 1980s, load shedding, labor troubles, and so on, finished what the Pakistani army couldn't. So, the mills in Belgudia also shut down. So that was the end of Mohini Mills. First destroyed by partition and their main mill being considered enemy property. And later on in the early 80s, suffering the fate that many people who have businesses at that time have also suffered, Jyoti Basu and the left front finishing the job that the Pakistani army started. By the way, it didn't only happen to businessmen, it happened to many Hindu refugees who managed to flee the genocide in East Pakistan and come to West Bengal and were mercilessly massacred in Maritime in 1979. That is also a history, by the way, that is very often not remembered. Now this history did not even end here. There was one last generation of Bengali entrepreneurs. And they were, and the most remarkable of those characters of that generation, that last generation, is somebody many of you have heard of as an athlete, a world famous swimmer called Mihir Sen. How many of you have heard of Mihir Sen the swimmer? So Mihir Babu was born in 1930 in Purulia. His family moved to Odisha, and they were very poor. So his mother, when he had just finished college, somehow managed to convince Biju Patnaik, who was then the CM, to finance her son to go to the UK to study law. So Mihir Babu went off to London, but he had just a one-way ticket, that is what the money he got. And he very quickly ran out of money. And so he began to work and menial labor, basically cleaning stations, doing menial jobs to pay for himself and studying to be a barrister. While he was doing all of this, and one would think this is quite hard work in its own right, he read somewhere that there was an American lady, I think, at that time, who swam across the English Channel. And she was the first woman to swim across the English Channel. And at that time, there were many of these records were being happened. This is the 1950s. There was this rush to climb Mount Everest. Many other things were going on. So it occurred to him that, look, we Indians seem to be left out of this. That we need to have a risk-taking culture. Now, so he decided that he too was going to try and swim the English Channel. The only problem was that he barely knew how to swim. So he began to take lessons in the local YMCA public swimming pool. And he would do it. So in addition to studying, working, doing menial jobs, he also began to take swimming lessons. And then he would ultimately go on to become the first Indian to swim the English Channel. And then, of course, he became so good at it that he would then swim all kinds of channels and water bodies all over the world, and ultimately would be recorded in the Guinness Book of World Records of that time as the greatest living long-distance swimmer in the world. Now, many of you know this too. What you may not know is that he came back to India after this, to Kolkata in fact. He joined the Calcutta High Court of that time, became a very successful criminal lawyer. And as you can tell, he's not a man who sort of stops at doing one or two things. He then set up one of India's first garments export businesses, silks and various other kinds of ready-made garments and things. And he became super successful. So by the early 70s, he was India's second largest exporter of silks and ready-made garments and became very, very wealthy. So again, in 1977, when the elections were happening, Jyoti Basu asked him for money and told him to campaign for him, which Mihir Babu refused. So when Jyoti Basu became Chief Minister, he deliberately shut down Mihir Babu's factories, which were in Howrah and in and around this area. He was bankrupted and he died in absolute penury in 1997. Almost forgotten. So this is what we did to ourselves. I'm telling you all these stories because, to go back to the right at the beginning, a people ultimately become the stories they tell themselves. If the stories you tell yourself is trade unionism, then you will get trade unionism. If you tell stories you tell yourself is Atilbaji on the rocks, you will get Atilbaji on the rocks. So, there are many policies that we need to introduce in order to revive Bengali entrepreneurship. But the first and most important thing that we need to change, ladies and gentlemen, is to change the stories that we tell ourselves. And for doing that, the first step is to go back and listen to our own history. The history that I told you is a very shortened version of the history of the Bengali people. It is about risk-taking, it's about business and entrepreneurship, and it goes back thousands of years. It is a history that we need to revive. The history of Atilbaji on the rocks is no more than 50 years old. And perhaps, in some ways, it makes sense that even the progeny of the great Jyoti Basu are also businessmen today. So I think it is a story that I wanted to tell you. Once we have imbibed this story to ourselves, then we will be able to take the other steps. Those may be policies, that may be finance, that may be land laws, it may be ease of doing business. All of them will follow if and only if we put this idea of entrepreneurship, risk-taking and business back into our bloodstream where it belongs. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.